Renewable resources like solar and wind often work best when their energy can be stored until it's needed. And as we transition to more and more renewable sources, which are great at making energy, but not always at the moment we need it, energy storage will become very important. Now, batteries, they're everywhere. They're in our phones, they're in our computers, they're in our cars, and now they're on our electricity grid. Last episode, we spoke with TransAlta about their utility-scale lithium-ion battery storage facility, WindCharger. Projects like WindCharger will be fundamental in reshaping our electricity grid. They can charge and deliver power rapidly, accurately, and they can respond in the blink of an eye. There's another kind of battery, though, the grid will need. One that is much larger than today's largest lithium-ion battery. One that can store energy for days and potentially for weeks. And one that can deliver significant amounts of energy for prolonged periods when the sun and the wind are taking a break. Pumped hydro facilities can do this. Instead of storing energy in the electrochemical potential of lithium ions, that energy is used to pump water between two lakes, one of which is way up a mountain from the other one. Then, when electricity is needed, the water that's been pumped uphill simply runs back downhill through a hydroelectric generator. So right now you might be thinking, well, that sounds cool, but what if you don't have two lakes and a mountain and a bunch of elevation between those lakes? Well, there's another idea I'd like you to hear about. In today's episode, the second of our two-part series on energy storage, I talk with Joe Zhou about his company Quidnet and the big idea they came up with for pumped energy storage, here on Carbon Copy. Hey, Joe, thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to talk to you because it seems like you've developed an opportunity that fits well in the future energy system and builds on our strengths here in Alberta. But we can talk a little bit about that later. First, tell me about Quidnet. I must say, it sounds like a cryptocurrency. Are you trying to sell me digital money?
No, that is not the current evolution of the product. So the Quidnet's goals is really to provide low-cost, long-duration energy storage to make sure that there can be not only renewable energy, but also renewable energy when it's needed on the grid.
Very cool. Sounds like an important goal. How did Quidnet start? What stage would you say you're at as a company?
So Quidnet started really looking at, the broader issue that's happening in the energy transition. The reason why you and I are able to kind of flip a switch and have the lights come on at any instant today in the electricity system is largely because there is a tremendous amount of energy being stored just upstream of it. That exists in the form of gas in the pipelines, gas in the reservoirs, and coal piles largely, and nuclear fuel rods. As we transition the energy system on the power side, a lot of that dispatchable storage capacity is going to go away as we have more and more pressures from a carbon perspective and a regulatory perspective on the thermal generators. And as we see solar and wind coming farther and farther down on the cost curve, the need for the energy system to transition is going to manifest into just almost an unimaginable amount of storage needed now in the electricity value chain. And so for that to be anywhere near cost effective, we thought that there had to be a different type of solution. While batteries are going to be, I think, a really great solution for electric mobility, I think there's going to be a lot of challenges to having that amount of batteries being paid for by the ratepayers in the power grid. And what we looked for was just a very different and much, much lower cost profile and cost structure when it comes to the provision of long duration energy storage. So that's really been our objective and our mission in terms of the role that we're hoping to play in the energy transition.
No pun intended, but let's drill a little deeper into the technology. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've developed and explain a little bit how it works.
Yeah, yeah. I think that the easiest way to think about our technology is actually to start from a point of looking at another technology that's been the primary format for energy storage on the grid, and then it's called traditional pumped hydro or pumped hydro storage. A lot of this has been built over the past decades. This is actually 94% of how the world stores electricity is by pumping water up a big mountain. So you essentially go into a mountainous region, you build a dam on top of a mountain. You oftentimes then tunnel through that mountain. You install or you essentially carve out the equivalent of an aircraft hangar inside the mountain to place some pumps and turbines, and then you have a lower reservoir that could either be a stream of or a river or a purpose-built pond that you then cycle the water between the low reservoir and the mountaintop to do energy storage. That form of storage is actually quite expensive, and as you can imagine, is very limited to only those regions that are near mountains. And actually, not a lot of load or not a lot of population tend to live right next to mountains. The bulk of the population centers are on the coast, as well as in the prairie flat regions across the country. And so, when you look at the what we're doing, it's essentially very similar in concept, but instead of pumping water up the mountain, we pump water down into the ground. A lot of the oil and gas development over the past century has really helped us understand a lot of geomechanical and geophysical properties of the subsurface. One of its properties is an ability to retain pressure. With the right types of rocks, we can store water under pressure underground instead of above ground and replicate much of those the same benefits that come with traditional pumped storage. The proven, power conversion equipment, the proven machinery, as well as you mentioned, relying on kind of a lot of the skill sets and supply chain that's been developed in Alberta when it comes to drilling, when it comes to working with the subsurface. So in this system, when you're charging, water is pumped from a surface pond down into the ground and stored under pressure. And when it's time to bring that electricity back onto the grid, we just open up the well and that water rushes up the wellbore, spins a turbine, and brings electricity back on the grid. It's a closed loop water system. The water cycles between our surface pond and the subsurface reservoir. And when you do energy storage in this way, you now no longer need to be tied to just those regions that have mountains.
So you said the water rushes up to the surface, so you don't need to pump it up?
That's right. That's right. So the water is stored under pressure in the subsurface. And the easiest way to think about it is as we pump water in, we are essentially elastically deforming the rock ever so slightly. And that deformation of the rock over cubic kilometers just stores a tremendous amount of energy. And when we want that energy back, once we open the well, that water that is under pressure, stored under pressure, will naturally rush up the well and to spin the turbine.
So if I understand that correctly, in essence, the Earth is effectively heaving to charge and discharge energy. I'm wondering, could that cause earthquakes or other potential issues underground?
So the amount of movement is indetectable. Frankly, frost heave across the seasons provide orders of magnitude more movement than our process.
We've all heard the phrase cost is king, and you talked about this being a low cost solution. I'm wondering, you compared it to traditional pumped hydro storage. How is this more cost effective than pumped hydro storage? Or even you compared to batteries previously. How do you get cost advantages with this solution?
Yeah, and so they actually exist on a couple of different dimensions. As we look at how the grid is going to evolve, we are just going to need longer and longer durations of energy storage. And what that manifests into for a battery is just more and more battery trays. Batteries, because it's a manufactured product, and because of the inherent cost of mining some of those minerals and refining those minerals, it's just very expensive to purchase or build an incremental tray of battery or the additional tray of batteries. Um, Today, that in the market is about $200, $300 a kilowatt hour to install an extra kilowatt hour, extra tray of batteries. And for us, we have a significantly different cost structure. For us, that equivalent cost is around $10 a kilowatt hour, and I think that is the scale of cost that you need to get to be able to provide a cost effective long duration energy storage solution. So that's how we compare versus batteries. And then you kind of flip that and look at how do we compare versus traditional pumped hydro. And there are a few factors that all do manifest in cost. Ultimately, the cost that the end user will have to bear. Some of those are direct factors. So tunneling through mountains, building within mountains, building on top of mountains is just very expensive. If we take out a lot of the civil capex components, which we can, our systems can be less than half the cost of pumped hydro, and we think they can be even lower. On top of that, for pumped hydro projects, they tend to take 5 years, 10 years, depending on the jurisdiction, to actually develop. And there's a lot of upfront capital that then needs to earn their return when the project's in operation. So that long lead time, the amount of capital that's needed to get the project through its upfront licensing and permitting is not trivial, and that accrues over time. So it all goes into a much higher cost of the system for traditional pumped hydro. And for us, we're able to get permitted in significantly shorter amounts of times because we have very different impacts from an environmental perspective. We're not damming up anything. We don't have upstream and downstream water impacts. And that's very important that it lends itself to a very different timeline when it comes to permitting. So not only are the direct costs much lower for us, the indirect kind of soft costs that also go into the system are also much lower for us.
You've mentioned long duration storage a couple times. Can you tell me why is it that we need long duration storage? Why can't we just store electricity and then re-release it later in the day?
Yeah. So, if you think about the nature of the power system, there are a lot of, let's call it, cycles, or natural cycles. There are daily cycles, right, where peak load on the system tends to happen at one part of the day, and the lowest load tends to happen on the system another part of the day. There are weekly cycles, weekday versus weekend differences. Then there are seasonal cycles. And as we look to match variable renewable generation to those cycles, there kind of emerges the need to shift large amounts of energy from one part of the day to the other part of the day. This doesn't work if it's just an hour or two or three or four. We are seeing some of the batteries being deployed in those kind of duration ranges, but to get us through the extent of the transition we're all aspiring to, we're just going to need significantly longer durations of storage to be able to fully match the times that renewable electrons are being generated to the times when the end consumers, the businesses, the homes, are using those electrons.
How long are we talking?
So we think that where the market is at today is at 10 hours for long duration storage. We think eventually that will go to tens of hours and maybe even to the hundreds of hours, but where kind of the initial market need for long duration storage is at 10 hours. And the importance of the cost structure when it comes to long duration storage is that as the market need evolves, as we get to longer and longer durations, it's very important that the cost or the incremental capex needed to meet that duration is extremely low. And so that's why, for batteries, when things are in the $200 or $300 a kilowatt hour, that's just really difficult. An extra 4 hours of storage being needed by the grid will literally double the cost of existing battery installations. And that's frankly just not an acceptable answer to the battery or energy storage problem. And so, as I said, we think the storage need for long duration starts at 10 hours, and we think that will evolve over time.
Now, you talked about pumping a fluid into the ground. Do you have different options for what fluid you use? Or were there some considerations that went into choosing a fluid in terms of the cost of what's available, in terms of, I don't know, maybe compressibility of the fluid? Any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah. So we use water, and that's kind of been part of the design since day one. We wanted things that were relatively abundant, um, and also had a very low environmental risk exposure, if that makes sense. For example, in oil and gas, there can be some fairly or relatively higher risk fluids in the wellbore. For us, we intentionally choose for that to be water, so that the overall environmental kind of profile for the facility is just completely different versus kind of some of the harsher oil and gas wells. And on top of that, water tends to be kind of much more available and easier to procure. I think the one difference that we would state is that there is the ability for our system, especially in regions where there is kind of more water scarcity. Our system can be run on kind of saline water or brackish water. Our initial test sites are run on fresh water, and the cycling has continued to be fresh water. But over time, as we get into regions where there are more and more demands for that potable water, I think we can then look at more kind of saline aquifers and those sources to provide the water to these systems.
Well, this is a really cool idea. There must be a story around how your team came up with the idea. Anything you can share?
So our team is a mix of actually a lot of folks from the oil and gas industry, and having seen, for example, our inventor grew up in the oil fields in Texas. I grew up in kind of oil and gas in Alberta, and we essentially the Howard who came up with the idea realized that in a lot of these oil and gas projects, people were able to see tremendous amount of pressurized water being stored in the subsurface. He then spent a stint of his career on the technical advisory board of a battery business where he got sensitized to the battery storage economics, and it clued into him that the need for much lower cost batteries can be met by these subsurface reservoirs that can store low or high pressure water.
Now, the $1 million question, I guess, is does it work? Have you proven it in the field? What stage are you at right now?
Yeah, so I think where we are in development is actually it maps really well to kind of the life cycle of oil and gas or any kind of subsurface resource development. So I would break that into three phases. The exploration phase, in oil and gas, that's figuring out is there oil and gas in this particular spot. The appraisal phase, which is that oil and gas economic, and then the development phase, which is then you take and you go and actually develop the entire oil and gas field. And so for us, instead of oil and gas, it's about energy storage. And where we are right now is we're at the end of the exploration phase with also some early appraisal data. So, and frankly, much of this work is actually being done in concert with Emissions Reduction Alberta and the project that we're working on together. At the end of exploration phase, where we are right now is that we've demonstrated the ability to form these storage lenses in the subsurface. We've demonstrated storage pressures that are equivalent to some of the tallest pumped hydro facilities in the world. So this facility or this test well that we're working on is about an hour outside of Lethbridge. So it's very, very flat land. And on that land, we've essentially been able to bring a 2,000-foot tall mountain to the prairies and replicate those kind of storage pressures and that kind of pumped hydro storage capability. We've also done cycling on that well to understand how the reservoir behaves over time, to understand how the efficiencies and the various components associated with friction and whatnot evolve as we cycle. And also looked at the water quality over time as we push water in and out of this well. As it contacts that rock, does it stay kind of that same fresh water quality, which the initial data suggested would. So that's where we're at right now. Is that we've demonstrated that this resource indeed exists, and we've also established kind of the scaling parameters on the basis of that cycle data. That's on the core tech. I think the nature of technology for us is that it really, they're really, you don't do this in the lab. There isn't a bench scale version of this. You go onto the field right away. And so by doing that, we're also we're also essentially progressing not only the core technology, but also progressing what's needed to implement the technology into real world projects. And by that, I mean establishing the regulatory framework for how these wells would be treated, and also establishing how do we interact and how do we kind of share the benefits of this technology with the landowner that's hosting this. What kind of lease structures would we use? For example, in Alberta, in the Alberta regulatory and legal context.
I love that analogy of bringing a mountain into the prairies, so to speak. Let's talk a little bit about scale, if you will. If you build this up commercially, or bring that equivalent mountain into the prairies, what size of generation would this be paired with? Or better yet, what types of capacity are we talking? Is this 1 megawatt, 10 megawatts, 100 megawatts? And how many hours worth of storage would that enable you to do?
So from a commercial perspective, our building blocks are going to initially start in kind of the 1 to 2 megawatts per well range. It's the closest analogy is actually is that we're actually quite similar to how a wind farm would look in terms of topology and architecture. So, in the example of wind, you're looking at single-digit megawatt turbines. They're placed throughout a field. They are linked together electrically to the grid and tied onto the grid as a single unit, multi-hundred megawatt unit, multi-hundred megawatt project, I should say. And so that's very similar to our architecture and topology. We would be 1 to 2 megawatt wells. They would be spaced apart, distributed across the field, and then linked together electrically to a common point of grid tie. Now, it remains to be seen what exactly the dominant form of storage deployment will be. One route would be co-located with renewable generators. So we can certainly interdisperse our wells amongst the solar field and share a lot of that lease footprint. The same can be said of wind. We can leverage the existing collection system of wind farms to essentially distribute our wells across that same footprint, and enable a very different level of dispatchability for those wind solar sites and wind sites. And we're in discussions with project partners on that today, and starting to look at real world examples of how we would distribute, what it would be the project financials, and so on. So that's one format. The other format that you're also seeing across North America is maybe the best spot for storage on the grid might not be where the existing wind and solar are. There may be other spots on the grid where storage can add the most value to deconstrain certain transmission bottlenecks. So in that case, it would be a standalone storage deployment. But in any case, and to answer your original question, I would think of the building blocks for Quidnet being, call it 1 to 2 megawatts initially per well, and those wells distributed across typically a rural field, and connected together electrically to a common point of interconnection to the power grid.
So I'm really sorry, Joe, but we literally have a fire alarm going off in my building right now.
Oh no!
I have a few more questions. If we can come back right away, I'll get back on the line. But we may have to reschedule the last few questions I have for you. And I didn't want to interrupt your very articulate answer. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to go, and I will fire you off an email when I get back into the building.
Of course. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
Good luck.
Thanks, Joe.
Bye.
Sorry, Morgan.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. Bye now. Emissions Reduction Alberta takes action on climate change and supports economic growth by investing in clean technology solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, lower costs, attract investment, and create jobs here in Alberta. These investments help innovators develop and demonstrate technology that can lower emissions at home and be exported to the world. That's why we've committed over $820 million to more than 220 projects worth a total of $6.6 billion. To learn more about Emissions Reduction Alberta, visit eralberta.ca. Okay, well, this hopefully doesn't seem too abrupt, Joe, and we can make it sound smooth on the recording, but I'm going to kind of pick up a little bit where we left off. So you mentioned you're working on a project here in Alberta with some funding from ERA. Can you tell me a little bit about that project.
Yeah, yeah. So we are working with the ERA essentially on the exploration and kind of early appraisal phase to really start or set the foundations for scaling this technology and this resource in the province. So as we recently jointly announced with the ERA a $5 million Canadian program to do exactly that. That program is divided into multiple phases, and the first phase is squarely focused on that exploration of this resource across the province. So mapping it, characterizing it, understanding the regulatory landscape, and also going into the field and using real live wells to validate and characterize that resource. We took over a 2003 vintage inactive gas well. That's about an hour outside of Lethbridge. We're using that gas well, we're plugging it off, in these production intervals and coming up into a shallow interval to validate a particular storage trend, if you will, or storage formation in the region that we're particularly interested in. This formation, along with others in the province, we think have terawatt hours in potential in terms of energy storage. That would be more storage than is needed for the province and likely neighboring provinces and states altogether. We think this is a tremendous resource that sits underneath a lot of where the wind and solar deployments are happening in the province. And so the goal in this first phase of the project, that we're actually coming up to the tail end of already, is to do that mapping, that characterization, and the real world in the field validation and verification of that storage resource. And that well outside of Lethbridge is the one that in which we've been able to confirm the formation of that storage lens and the cycling and operating pressures of that lens being equivalent to multi-thousand foot tall pumped hydro facilities.
That's really exciting. I can't wait to see some action in the field or something that can that you can walk around and take a look at. Tell me, how do you know if the project is successful?
So there are success metrics all along the way for this project. I think for the first phase and the exploration phase, I think we're actually feeling really good collectively about what we're seeing in the field, and we're, I think, ready to move into the next phase, which is this kind of early appraisal. Where now we try to scale up the well, we try to scale up the flow rates, we look at forming partnerships with renewable developers in the province to build an initial pipeline of projects. And so that becomes kind of the milestone and the target we're shooting for next, is to get through an appraisal phase. In a typical kind of subsurface resource appraisal phase, the types of things that you're looking to do is delineate the resource, to really find out where, or fine-tune the boundaries of where we think this resource is firming up the resource marketing plan, right? Figuring out how we're going to commercialize and monetize the resource, and deploy a few facilities, or in this case of the area project, one well at a much larger scale to validate and start getting data on how the resource would operate at those commercial scales. Things that we would care about there are continue to look at round trip efficiency, look at flow rates, look at durations. The initial durations we'll be targeting are 10 hours in terms of continuous discharge. And start to look at how, when it comes to a solar plant, how do we integrate the power electronics with a inverter-based kind of set of power electronics on the solar plant, and also with wind farms, how do we integrate with the existing wind assets? So those are the types of things that we'll be looking at through this next phase when it comes to appraising this resource and really setting up the foundations for commercial scale rollout.
Now, you mentioned the evolving need for long duration storage. Tell me, how big is the potential, maybe right now or looking out into the future, for this across Alberta or even across Canada? If you have a sense for that, could you do 5 of these, 10 of these, maybe 50 of these? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's probably 2 orders magnitude above that, right? So if you look at the Alberta grid, look at the Alberta internal load, the order of magnitude we're talking about is kind of 10 gigawatts, right, of total load. Not exactly 10 gigawatts, but that's the order of magnitude. As we shift to a high renewable penetration power mix, and as we look at some of these thermal assets that may be facing kind of their end of life, you tens of percentage, tens of percent of that existing demand would need to be matched by long duration storage. And there are studies out there where that number is much, much higher. So we're talking about, long duration storage needs in the gigawatts. To fulfill 1 gigawatt of energy storage, we would need to be doing hundreds of wells. So the kind of ultimate deployment potential and our goal would be to deploy these types of facilities, hundreds of these types of facilities across the province. I think by virtue of this being a much more distributed type of asset in terms of the kind of the modules, right, are in the 1 and 2 megawatts initially. This will allow us to really disperse the economic benefits of this build out of assets across the province, across a lot of different communities, across a lot of different landowners, and we're certainly really excited to be working to see that commercial vision through.
You've clearly come a long way already as a young organization with some exciting accomplishments and some more to come. And I can only assume some challenges or barriers along the way. What are some of the biggest lessons you've learned in your journey so far?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Mark. And I think, frankly, to kind of answer the first part of what you mentioned there, a lot of the reasons why we've been able to make so much progress so quickly, I mean, really, we really started hitting the go button 3 years ago. And in 3 years, we've accomplished a lot. And a lot of that is thanks to the existence of just a tremendous supply chain that's already been built by the oil and gas industry. There's just an incredible amount of talent that already knows what we're trying to do and understands that. Despite our core team being quite small, we've been able to mobilize to date well over 100 people into the field. A lot of, for example, the folks that we mobilize in Alberta are from the oil and gas industry, the drillers, the workover rigs, the pumpers. It's really thanks to that existing supply chain that's allowed us to do so much already in these kind of past years. But there's certainly, to your point, have been challenges along the way. I think it's incredibly humbling to be working on anything in the subsurface, and it's certainly not to be taken for granted. When you're working in the subsurface, it's just incredibly hard to understand exactly what's happening in the subsurface. And the oil and gas industry have developed a tremendous amount of existing technology sets for how to understand and how to, quote unquote, see what's happening, hundreds of meters below ground. That's been something that we've really benefited from, but certainly is a challenge when you look at trying to bring a new subsurface resource to the market. I think another challenge is when you try to interact with the real world, is that it is incredibly important to bring all the stakeholders along with you. And that's something that we spent a lot of energy and focus on. Bringing the local community along, helping the landowners understand exactly what we're doing, jointly kind of doing the site designs, the landowners, so that it works for their existing land use. We're able to sit outside the crop circles. We're able to, if we're building an access roadway into our pad, that this is a pad that also makes sense for the landowners, and an access road that makes sense for landowners. And the other piece is working with the regulators. In a lot of ways, our wells are actually a lot less complex and lower temperature and lower pressure than what they're used to regulating. But nevertheless, it's just something different. And so really spending the time working with the regulators, helping them understand exactly what we're trying to do, how we are putting the protective measures in place, and jointly developing the kind of regime and framework for permitting these assets. That's something that we've also spent quite a bit of time and energy doing. And, when you think of a new energy technology company, people tend to think research in the labs, building models on a bench. For us, a lot of that has happened in the field. And when you do that in the field, there are just these other facets of field work that we needed to be thoughtful of and make sure that we do right as we can implement this technology in the field.
Yeah, that holistic and cooperative and collaborative approach seems to be a recipe for success. So you've touched on this already, but I want to maybe probe a little bit further, if that's all right. Can you talk a little bit about the role of collaboration and maybe even resources that are available in your success so far?
So I think a lot of times when people are trying to build a new hardware technology, oftentimes it comes with the burden of having to establish a meaningfully new supply chain. A lot of, when you look at fuel cells, there were different types of rare earth mineral supply chains that needed to be considered for those types of technologies. That the same goes for, I think, a lot of hardware energy technologies, is that you have to invest upstream in the supply chain, and we've been incredibly lucky and incredibly thankful that we did not have to do that. That when we had the discussion and did our planning around how would we go and kind of demonstrate this technology in the field, the one discussion that we didn't have to do is how do we go build a drilling supply chain, or how do we go build a pressure pumping supply chain, or they were all there already, and they exist in just astronomical numbers, thanks again to the oil and gas industry. And it's really owing to that we've been able to run pretty quickly with actually a fairly limited amount of capital, to get to where we are today. I can't stress enough how different of a journey it would be if we had to essentially, for example, invent drilling. Like we almost take that for granted nowadays, but it's actually not a trivial thing. And hundreds of years of investments have gone into the ability for us to drill hundreds of feet, thousands of feet below ground. And that's something that we can just call a kind of a local provider for, and they will come and they'll bring their rigs and they'll kind of be able to work on the well with us. That's just an incredibly unique opportunity for us. And like I said, we just owe so much to there being that ecosystem already in the places that we're working.
Yeah, it's amazing that we're all standing on the shoulders of giants that came before and building on what was done before. So thanks for that. I'm wondering, I like the focus of your organization on the geomechanical pump storage technology, but can you tell me, is there anything else your team is working on now in parallel with the project that you're advancing with ERA that you can share with us?
So we're certainly always looking for alternative applications that can provide value to the energy industry or other industries. One example I'll give you is, as part of our work, we're tuning certain kind of formulations for sealing the rock or plugging up pores in the rock, so that we can even better retain pressure and over time for our storage lenses. And we're seeing that there are actually some very interesting alternative applications for that in the carbon sequestration space and in other kind of subsurface spaces. So we're keeping an eye on that. We're looking, frankly, there have been partners that have come to us asking to work together on things like that. We're evaluating that today. We're certainly not launching any spin-offs anytime soon, but we do see some pretty interesting alternative applications to kind of the core technology that we've been developing.
That's very cool. So maybe we can close off. I was going to ask you, is there anything I didn't ask you about that you'd want our listeners to know?
Look, I think that as you look at what's happening in the power transition, and especially as you look just near Alberta, right? You look at neighbors to the south, you look at what's happening in California, look at ERCOT in Texas, there are real life reliability implications of the power transition. And there are problems that exist in industrial scale today, in terms of keeping or maintaining reliability on the power grid as we have more and more intermittent resources come on, and as we have more and more thermal dispatchable resources come off. So the problem is very much already here. This is no longer about, is there a market for energy storage? There is the market, there is the need, it's manifesting physically already in the real world. Yes, it may take a bit of time for the market constructs to fully catch up, but the underlying issues when it comes in terms of reliability, they're in existence today. So we need solutions that can speak to that today, and we need solutions that can scale up, that can rise to that scale in the short time period we have ahead of us to make sure that our grids are continue to be reliable as we go through this transition. So that's why we're really excited about the work that we're doing today, and that's why we're excited to continue to accelerate the work that we're doing today, and that's why programs and entities such as the ERA and the project we're doing together that are so important to us being able to accelerate to meet those demands.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. It's always a pleasure talking with you. I really look forward to seeing this project built in the ground in Alberta and to see what happens next for Quidnet.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.